Dawn settles like a hush over a nameless lake, and in the mind's eye, an arm rises from the water, pale as cloud and steady as a column of stone, holding aloft a blade that seems older than light, brighter than ice, heavier than destiny. And everything begins with that shining edge that will not rust in memory, because some weapons are forged from story rather than iron, and those do not dull as centuries pass, which leaves a question floating on the still surface. What is Excalibur, and why does it still ripple through time? The sword is whispered as a kingmaker and kingbreaker, a proof of sovereignty and a contract with otherworldly forces, shivering with meanings that clung to Britain before Britain had a name. And even that name is slippery, shifting across tongues like a reflection across waves, with Welsh Caledfwlch mutating to Latin Caliburnus before turning in French romances into Excalibur, and finally into the form we can recite in the dark. Yet each phonetic drift carries a fragment of an older myth, and fragments tend to magnetize one another in the quiet hours. History pleats itself around the blade, folding won battles and lost kingdoms into the scabbard's shadow, and scholars have long reached for the source that is earliest and most unclouded, finding the Welsh triads and tales where the name Caledfwlch hard breach, hard cleaver glints amid storms of feats and wonder, echoing the Irish Caledfwlch and other island memories of swords that split hills and command storms, as if the archipelago itself remembered the bright shock of metal first drawn from ore and ritual, waiting to be recognized again. Where there is a sword, there is water in the Arthurian tradition, and the water is not ornament but origin, because lakes are thresholds in Celtic memory, places where the living and the dead touch fingertips through mist, where offerings sink carrying requests and promises, and the image of the blade returned to the lake at the cycle's end is older than any courtly poem, as if the island's people always knew that certain objects must pass through water to change their weight upon the world, and change always leaves currents to follow. Archaeology finds the currents in silence and silt, where Bronze and Iron Age blades lie folded, deliberately wounded, sleeping in bogs and rivers like the Thames, the Witham, the Shannon, and in the northern peatlands that tanned human skin and preserved the weave of a cloak. And every recovered sword with a snapped spine seems to testify to a pact that was being kept, a contract of war in land and harvest. So when Excalibur flashes in the lake's hand, it is less invention than condensation, the memory of countless iron gifts resurfacing as one invincible story. Cornwall's moorland offers a pool, and the pool offers a rumor, and people point to Dosmary as the place where the sword sank, while others insist the waters of Slaughter Bridge, or the stillness near Bodmin Moor, know the truth. And the landscape aids the fiction by presenting glassy basins with antique moods, where reeds click in conspiracies and a sudden wind skates the surface into trembling, and any stone tossed there summons more than rings, because reputation collects around waters that look like gateways to somewhere just beyond the language we have. The blade in the stone is another surface that conceals depth, because stones in British myth do not sit like dead weight, but sing. Groan and test and anvil and rock are Smith's altar and king's throne pressed into one, a rite that suggests that sovereignty must be extracted from difficulty, wrested from earth and craft, and the persistence of the motif hints that medieval pens were tattooing a far older skin, where kingship required a sign from iron and granite alike, and signs rarely show themselves without a watcher willing to wait. Waiting is the heart of the sword's life, for a weapon of kings spends more hours sleeping than cutting, and that long sleep becomes a story of custody, of who holds, who hides, who returns. And it is in that quiet custodianship that the Lady of the Lake arrives, not as a person only, but as a title held by water's guardian power, a sovereignty presence older than cathedrals, offering a blade with one hand and demanding the scabbard be cherished with the other, since bloodlessness was once more valuable than brilliance under the sun. The scabbard's blessing, the promise that wounds will not bleed while it is worn, complicates the simple heroics of a shining sword, introducing the eerie arithmetic of protection as power. And some versions make its loss the true defeat, suggesting that fame prefers the glitter of a strike, while kingdoms live or bleed by the less visible things. And the theft of that scabbard by his sorceress half-sister becomes less melodrama and more treaty, broken with whatever presence lurked in those waters, because bargains with thresholds have clauses that echo for generations. Yet tales do not arrive pure in any century, and when the Normans and their heirs inked the island's fantasies into chronicles and romances, they were binding a wounded land through parchment into a single mythic spine. And the name Caliburnus appears under Geoffrey of Monmouth's hand as if it always belonged to a long-limbed king of Britain, even while the sources behind it are a fog of bardic fragments, because political needs prefer crisp silhouettes, and silhouettes, once cut, cast shadows that can reach the floorboards of modern rooms. The sword's light filters downward into cathedral crypts and abbey gardens where monks tended bones and stories. And it was in such cloisters that the notion of a grave for a once and future king took root among beehives in scripture, with a hint that relics might anchor donations and pilgrimage routes. And one can imagine how a community might dream of the blade's relic to complete the set, though no such claim held the field for long, because some objects resist being tamed into reliquaries, preferring the company of fog and marsh. To follow that resistance, one must step off the path and into the wetlands themselves, where wooden trackways from prehistory lie under turf, where offerings of swords and shields and skulls glitter in the mind before they are found, and the logic of water as witness leads back, again and again, to the image of a hand emerging not from fantasy, but from the collective habit of giving iron to the depths. And somewhere beneath a northern sky, a diver's torch will catch on a pattern-welded hilt, and we will feel time pause as if about to speak. Long before printing presses stitched fixed versions of the legend, quills were already weaving iron into narrative, and the blade's earliest literary glimmers are not the royal centerpiece of a tidy myth, but a scattered flare through Welsh prose and poetry, where names like Caledfwlch ring with hardness and fracture, and this root word suggests an instrument of cleaving through fates, rather than one of mere ornament, which becomes essential once Geoffrey of Monmouth positions Caliburnus as the royal sword of an imperial Arthur, because origin often hides in the sound a name makes in the mouth. Geoffrey's chronicle is the Great Bridge, a 19th century of the 12th, spanning older tradition into a new political myth of Britain, and on his arch, the sword gleams as part of a regalia set among dragons and giants, which invites later hands to filigree the metal with tests and marvels. And when the Norman poet Wace converts this narrative into verse, and Layman in English expands the scene with a stone and a ceremony, the blade's story curls around the coronation rite until it shines as the proof of right, making each subsequent retelling a polishing rather than a forging. Across the Channel, the French romances begin to braid new strands around the iron, and Chrétien de Troyes and the authors of the Vulgate and post-Vulgate cycles shuttle the sword back and forth between miracle and symbol, until Thomas Malory, centuries later, catches in English the double momentum of an anvil test and a lake gift, explaining that the stone blade breaks in battle, and the Lady of the Lake delivers a replacement, which neatly reconciles competing traditions, though the neatness leaves seams, and seams are places where heat once lived and can live again. The scabbard's charm enters the tradition like a legal clause, an amendment that transforms the sword from aggressive glamour to a medical policy for kingship. And when Morgan Le Fay arranges its theft, the legend gives away a sober knowledge that power is not merely in striking, but in enduring. Because a kingdom with a bleeding king is a kingdom that bleeds field by field. And this notion resembles ancient sovereign rights where prosperity is tied to the body of the ruler, suggesting that the scabbard was a ritual tool disguised as accessory, waiting to be noticed. Ritual interests shadow every element of the myth, and the very act of drawing a sword from a stone or an anvil sits midway between smithcraft and sacrament, perhaps echoing iron's extraction from ore, or the inaugural struggles of an artisan king. And when one compares this to Irish tales of the Lie of Fail, the stone of destiny that cries out under the rightful ruler, the parallels assemble with quiet insistence, as if the British Isles encoded political legitimacy in objects that resist or respond, and those objects hold memory even when their stones are silent to us. Other European swords glimmer in the periphery, leaning their reputations toward Excalibur as if in conspiratorial greeting, because legends borrow across borders without passports. And French Joyeuse, Roland's Durendal, the Norse Tyrfing, and the Spanish Tizona all bear their own burdens of invincibility, blood, and inheritance, suggesting that medieval listeners expected a hero to be recognized by an extraordinary blade. And yet Excalibur's watery provenance sets it apart, bound to a feminine otherworld agency, rather than solely a band of warriors, which might preserve an even older island pattern, folding goddess and kingship into one complicated offering. The lake giver is sometimes called Nemu or Vivian, and behind the names stands a shape that resembles a sovereignty goddess, the land itself personified, who grants rule and retracts it when balance fails. And this motif, peering through Christian varnish, makes the lake less a mere backdrop and more a participant with its own terms, which helps explain why return is compulsory in the death scenes, because debts to the threshold must be paid lest the realm drift into drought or disorder. And the echoes of such fertility bargains still shuttle through the reeds. Yet it is tempting to hunt a historical core beneath the mythic birch bark, to imagine a real sword belonging to a war leader in the 5th or 6th century, a Romano-British commander who gathered small kingdoms against invaders, and here the name of Lucius Artorius Castus, an officer of an earlier age, surfaces in scholarly waters, joined by the intriguing stationing of Sarmatian cavalry in Britain, whose steppe traditions of banners and dragon standards might have seeded some of the Arthurian imagery, because legends often fit themselves to the strongest available skeletons. The Sarmatians carried tales of swords as tribal emblems and revered banners that roared in the wind, and one theory proposes that their service under Rome left behind a cluster of motifs ripe for adoption by local storytellers, who then married them to native watery rites and Hilfert memories, yielding a composite myth with a shining blade at its heart. And whether or not this is the precise route, it reveals how a weapon can become a weaving of migrations, trade, and survival, with each strand hiding a fingerprint and a riverbed. Metallurgy itself provides its own gravity, because iron is a jealous craft, demanding heat, patience, and secrecy, and the mystery of how to draw flexible strength from brittle ore gives swords an aura even before a story touches them, which means Excalibur's aura could be a magnified memory of pattern-welded brilliance, the ripple patterns like water frozen into steel, blades that seem to carry stormlight under their surface, and in an age when no one could quite agree how such beauty was born, a late gift explanation felt like truth told slant. Meanwhile, anvil and altar sometimes shadow one another in ritual, and the spectacle of a sword drawn from the immovable suggests an investiture that the audience can see, perhaps echoing church rites, where relics authenticate the sacred, and the intertwining of stone, steel, and sanctity made for irresistible ceremony during a time when rulers required both martial and spiritual sanction, which may be why later retellings accent the public nature of the test, because legitimacy that can be witnessed resists contestation, yet even witnessed miracles acquire disputes when kingdoms change hands. Between parchment and peat, between choir and marsh, the sword's trail slides, and every attempt to anchor produces more shimmer than substance. But the shimmer matters, for it draws us toward landscapes that keep secrets under waterlogged boards and chalky uplands that remember Hilfert beacons. And it points us toward cellars and library stacks where scribes leaned close to candlelight, deciding whether a blade should be named this or that, and their decisions guide our search now, even as a colder glow begins to gather from Roman inscriptions and blackened forges. If we let that glow lead, it spills into barracks ruins, and the damp corners of museums, where a fragmentary dedicatory stone remembers an officer whose name sounds familiar in the bones. And nearby, a glass case holds a sword with a folded pattern, shimmering like fish scale in shadow. And one imagines a lineage of prestige weapons passing down among local leaders, each acquiring a notch of story until one blade bore more narrative than steel. And the tantalizing aspect is that such a relic could still lie somewhere in silt, waiting for a hand that is not a hand to present it. There is a Roman road unlacing the countryside beneath hedgerows and tractor ruts, straight as an oath and equally hard to keep. And along its margins retired soldiers settled into villas and timber halls, their Latin names colliding with Brythonic rhythms, producing a generation who could pray in both tongues and sharpen swords with the same focus. And in this liminal dusk of empire, it becomes easy to imagine a war leader whose favorite blade acquired a personal gravity, a gravity heavy enough to collect miracles. And that is the grain to which the legend's varnish may be sticking. The inscription for Lucius Artorius Castus, recovered in Dalmatia, and traveled by tracing paper and scholarship into British arguments, is a small stone with long shadows, naming a commander of cavalry with campaigns that could be stretched by imagination into the island. And though the dates resist a perfect fit with post-Roman Britain, the presence of Artorius among Roman officers gives a natural sounding board for the later figure's name, while a separate presence, the Sarmatian cavalry sent to Britain in the 2nd century, contributes wind and horse and dragon to the tuning, leaving us listening for echoes. Those Sarmatians came from lands where the sword was a banner, and the banner a creature of the sky, where iron had taste and temper, and could be sworn upon as if it were a living judge. And their long sojourn in the island may have seeded images that set well with local rites, because a culture comfortable offering blades to water would find no difficulty in imagining a blade that speaks for the land. And when the dragon standard snapped above cavalry heads on a misty hill, the noise could be mistaken for prophecy, and prophecy is a fine scabbard for steel. In the half-light of late antiquity and early medieval Britain, the smith's fire became a small sun in every scattered community, and the art of pattern welding turned bars of iron and steel into flowing grain like wood, like muscle, like water held in metal form, creating blades that seemed animate under torchlight, their surfaces flashing herringbone or laddered waves. And this visual astonishment is enough to birth a rumor of unbreakable edges, because when craft exceeds understanding, the leap to magic requires no coercion, and need only a storyteller attentive to glimmering curves. Further east and south, crucible steels were being made, and ingots traveled up trade routes in slow caravans of rumor and risk. The legendary watered pattern of Wootz and the mystique of Damascus, passing through hands that seldom spoke a common language. And a prestigious blade in the West might be a marriage of local technique and imported brilliance, which casts Excalibur as not merely British but cosmopolitan, a sword that carried the whole old world's metallurgical gossip in its veins. And the more threads pulled into it, the stronger the tapestry becomes for those who would venerate it. Names stamped into blades add drama to museum glass, and when Ulfberth shines from a Carolingian-era sword, the name stands less for an individual and more for a workshop prestige, a brand before branding, and people gazing at that bright mark often feel the magnet of authenticity, eager to declare a blade royal or sainted, which explains how any superior weapon could attract a near veneration that becomes tale, particularly when a community's memory needs a lodestone to arrange its courage. And every lodestone requires a geology of belief under it, not just iron. That geology includes water again, because bogs and lakes are time travelers' lockers, preserving wood, flesh, and the edge of a blade that slept long enough to forget the last hand that closed around it. And divers in the Thames, the Needham Bog in Denmark, Illerup in Jutland, and countless lesser-known lakes have brought to air swords that look unreasonably fresh, patterns visible after centuries, like messages from the forges still legible enough to tempt speculation. And every time such a blade is held in museum light, the question of Excalibur's physical possibility grows less fanciful. Meanwhile, in the candlelit world of abbeys, another craft was underway, the forging of relics and narratives as communities competed for attention and grace. And Glastonbury became a theater of revelation in the 12th century, when a grave was presented as Arthur's, with an inscribed cross and bones tall enough to be called royal, a discovery perfectly timed to the abbey's needs after a fire. And the political climate found it useful, because a dead Arthur quieted dangerous fantasies of return, while a live Excalibur would have complicated claims of closure in uneasy ways. Glastonbury's marsh-fringed hill, the Tor rising from the Somerset levels like a ship sailing out of mist, had long been rumored as Avalon or near to it, and the monks were not inventing a sacred landscape from nothing but channeling existing currents, wrapping Christian narrative around older wetlands knowledge and trackways that reached back to prehistoric wooden causeways. And whether or not they believed in a literal sword in a literal lake, they understood that stories anchor pilgrims better than nails, and anchors are necessary when floods and kings change their minds. Elsewhere in Europe, the royal sword evolved from battlefield instrument to ceremonial axis, a bright line through which law and divine favor were supposed to flow. And British coronation regalia eventually included swords of state and mercy, objects paraded before the ruler, as if to remind crown and crowd that sovereignty is a balancing act of edge and restraint, which suits the memory of Excalibur's scabbard perfectly, suggesting that ancient insights persisted as choreographed movement, even when the original lake's name was forgotten, and forgetting often protects the mystery better than vigilance. Conspiracy enjoys rooms where religion and politics meet, and whispers have long suggested that Templar commanderies or secret orders guarded artifacts of deep myth to leverage influence or stave off chaos. And one can imagine a blade kept in a chest under wax seals and oaths, brought out only to settle disputes of dynastic succession, a talisman wielded behind curtains that never parted for common eyes. And the lack of proof is the point in such ideas, because absence is a vacuum stories rush to fill, and the humming sound that follows can be persuasive in the right darkness. Across the centuries, antiquarians and gentlemen explorers in tweed and rubber boots trudged through marsh margins with poles, drawing up peat that stank of age and hope, certain that one day the true sword would consent to rise, and their maps, letters, and quiet failures accumulate into an archive of longing now shelved in university libraries. Faint pencil lines leading to a pool that recurs in accounts, a pool a farmer swore was bottomless, a pool a rector warned against on moonless nights, and every trace suggests a ritual deposit waiting to become public once more. In the end, whether held by Templars, monks, or mud, the sword's endurance lies in its capacity to gather meanings around a center that refuses to show itself. And this quality transforms a simple weapon into a weather system of symbolism, setting wind through our museums and across our moors, promising a sensation just beyond the next bend in the path. And it is at that bend that a rumor sits, the whisper of an unmarked case in a provincial museum store, a blade with a wave pattern, and an undocumented provenance, sleeping behind a door that sticks in damp. The search moves outward to the places themselves, because landscape is the oldest archive, and the Somerset levels bleed mist even in high summer, their willows leaning as if to listen to something under the water, while Glastonbury Tor rises with the wrongness of a ship stranded, a holy geometry that caught multiple faiths like fish in its wake. And when people call it Avalon, they repeat layers of certainty and guesswork that mutually reinforce, a self-fulfilling cartography where a lake-gift sword could return without surprising anyone, which is why every puddle there gained significance. Wetlands hold architecture, and archaeological cuts have exposed Neolithic trackways laid with a care that implies traffic towards something worthy of ritual urgency, planks pinned into the peat that once led to islands that no longer exist. And as spades revealed woven baskets and antler tools alongside deliberately broken weapons, it became clear that water was used to seal promises, not merely discard the outworn, which naturally emphasizes the logic of returning a king's blade to its first city of reflection, because closure requires a reverse path taken with reverence and fear. Elsewhere across the channel, the forest of Brocéliande in Brittany lures seekers with its springs and stones named in honor of Arthurian episodes. And the Fountain of Barrington, a pool that can summon storms with a bowl of water, sits like a lid placed on an old pressure, steam curling up as legend condenses on oak bark. And whether or not any medieval poet ever stood under those trees, the forest plays its role perfectly, providing the humidity in which steel puns on water, and even skeptics tend to slow down their breathing, as if the air knew something essential. Dosmary Pool in Cornwall stares back with a simple eye, winged by low hills and occasional sheep, its surface sheeted with weather that changes without notice, and the local stories accumulate like pondweed, calling it bottomless, or a night-stopping kind of water that does not allow sleep to cross. And divers and dredgers have probed without resolution, finding industrial debris and the shadows of earlier attempts. But the absence of proof does not bleach the place of mood, because a pool can be famous for refusing as well as yielding, and refusal is its own form of narrative. Modern underwater archaeology has refined the gaze with side-scan sonar, magnetometers, and patient grids of silt sieving, making discoveries in rivers that seemed well-known, pulling up swords curled like leaves after sacrifice, their hilts encrusted into anonymity, yet with pattern faintly visible once the mud is coaxed away, and each find shifts the burden of plausibility a little, demonstrating that iconic objects do indeed sleep in surface waters for centuries, and it takes only one unusual hilt or unusual alloy to invite a designation, a dangerous invitation, because names add gravity quickly. National collections offer glimpses alongside DAPs, and the British Museum and the Museum of London present river swords from the Thames with context that hums with ritual intent, while in storerooms across the country catalog cards bear lacunae, field notes lost, donor names misread, coordinates off by a mile. And it is in these administrative abysses that one expects to find what rumor calls a candidate, a blade that predates heraldic fantasy, yet postdates the Romans, something 5th or 6th century, with unusual workmanship. And museums sometimes prefer their mysteries quiet, for quiet protects as well as conceals. Coronation swords still slice the air in Westminster Abbey, their edges blunted but their symbol keen, and the sword of state with its wide, polished face catches light like a quiet lake, while the sword of mercy with its squared tip suggests the scabbard's logic survived as liturgy. And when these are carried past choir stalls, the choreography binds monarch, church, and nation into a pattern familiar to listeners of Arthur, who sense an old doctrine beneath the gold. That rule must be balanced by clemency to keep the land fertile, and fertility was always the deeper promise. Comparisons multiply in cabinets of curiosities across Europe, where Joyeuse glitters in Paris with composite parts spanning centuries, and the Spanish Tizona claims the aura of El Cid in Burgos, and debate around these blades ensures a useful lesson for Excalibur seekers, reminding that even famous swords are palimpsests of replacement and repair. That identity can be a decision rehearsed until it becomes tradition, and thus the possibility that Excalibur was a curated object rather than unitary artifact grows, a confluence of metal and belief, which complicates but deepens the pleasure of pursuit. In literature, the forest and lake scenes are stages for tests, but in the field, the tests are bureaucratic and ethical, permissions to dredge, to scan, to publish, and the rhythm of grant cycles replaces thunderclaps. Yet the feeling is uncannily similar when a sonar shadow appears where no map shows a wreck, and a small team leans over redoubts in a moat that rocks slowly, because that rhythm is a heartbeat sounding through equipment, the drum of anticipation as ancient emptiness prepares to yield one bright line, or to swallow effort without trace, which it often prefers. Skeptical voices point to the allure of confirmation and the tendency to see patterns where none were intended, arguing that folded swords in water are everywhere, and no single example can bear the weight of Arthur's crown. Yet myth is not a question of monogamy, and Excalibur's power may reside precisely in its ability to inhabit any number of candidates simultaneously, making each lake blade a partial avatar, a node in a web of memory. And this decentralization suits the original sovereignty right, spread across islands and tongues, a chorus rather than a solo voice. There are, nevertheless, private stories that unsettle neat conclusions, like the whisper of a sword lifted from a fenland drain in the mid-20th century by a worker who kept it behind a cupboard until a grandson sold it at an informal sale. No paperwork, only the hazy provenance of a village name, and a sense that it felt important. And such off-record journeys are the bane of academic certainty, because they can never be verified yet never fully dismissed. And they seed the suggestion that somewhere on a farmhouse wall hangs a legend waiting for a safer audience. Follow the suggestion further, and it points to locked rooms in old houses, Masonic halls with display cases, regimental museums with a corner of unlabeled steel, and the odd private chapel where a sword rests above a door, blessed by habit if not by text. And curators of such spaces sometimes hesitate to invite the avalanche of attention that a dramatic identification would bring, preferring quiet stewardship to the storm of claim and counterclaim, which means that a convincing candidate could already be under light, already cleaned of mud, already quietly measured, waiting for courage as much as for proof. If courage is mustered, it will likely come from an intersection of methods, a metallurgical fingerprint aligning with a stratigraphic context, a literary clue anchoring a landscape tradition, a place name holding a watery memory that LiDAR confirms with the ghost of a vanished mirror. And the convergence will feel less like discovery and more like a lens snapping into focus, making old mist cohere into a single tree, a single shoreline, a single gleam. And in that moment the lake will seem to inhale, as if ready to extend its hand again under a different sky. Stand near any reflective surface long enough, and it begins to behave like a mind, returning images altered by depth and movement. And Excalibur is such a reflection, a blade sharpened by centuries of looking, so that what we now see is a precise blur of iron and idea, a weapon that cuts best through ambiguity. And in this skill lies its durability. For kingship itself was never just a legal status, but a tightrope across expectations and fears, and the sword's light assisted the crossing, drawing eyes upward, buying time while history arranged its next gust. At the bottom of the pool floats a theology of water, older than churches yet comfortable within them, where the Lady of the Lake is both guardian of thresholds and polite disguise for a sovereignty presence that demands reciprocity. And when the sword is offered, it is not mere charity, but the beginning of a contract, a requirement that strength be mirrored by restraint, blade by scabbard. And betraying this symmetry is why stories punish those who steal the sheath, because disorder begins not with a cut, but with the promise that no cut will bleed, and the land keeps an accounting. This accounting pulls the myth toward fields and harvests, reminding that a king's body is a weather vane, a map of the kingdom's health, and returning the sword becomes an agrarian act as much as a spiritual one, ensuring that the iron returns to the source so the seasons can progress, and that the ruler who once drew power from the earth must yield it back so young wheat can stand, a cycle that places glory as a byproduct rather than a goal. And listening closely, one hears in this a criticism of conquest, buried under the applause of tournaments. Christian glosses overlay the pagan circuitry with care, turning the lake into a baptismal font and the sword into a cross-shaped reminder that authority should be washed as well as wielded. And in the Grail cycles, the quest shifts from royalty to sanctity and back again. Yet the sword endures as an axis, sometimes broken, sometimes reforged, because institutions cannot do without sharp symbols. And even as the Grail absorbs the appetite for transcendence, Excalibur keeps the appetite for justice honest, its edge making sure that visions do not drift too far from fields and walls. Meanwhile, The forge persists as a sanctum, whether in a bog iron shack or high medieval workshop where apprentices live by rhythm, and the knowledge that pattern-welded swords carry delicate inner landscapes of strength and flexibility sustains the sense that a great blade is a miracle of balance, not brute force, which explains the enchantment's endurance better than fantasy alone, because every proper Excalibur must be both beautiful and competent, and the combination is rare enough to be worth the story, especially when that story excuses failure to find the exact original by praising the type. Etymology keeps the edge honed, and hearing Caledfwlch and Caladfwlch alongside Caliburnus and Excalibur brings the island's languages into conversation, revealing a family of hard-bright words that vibration alone feels like hammering, as if the name were being forged anew with each tone. And this linguistic liquidity resembles the lake motif again, names flowing until they fit the storyteller's shore. A reminder that identity is allowed to be dynamic without losing its center. And that is perhaps the hardest lesson a relic-seeking culture must learn when proof refuses to rise. Proof, however, sometimes arrives sidelong, not as a single artifact crowned by consensus, but as a crescendo of correlated details, a recognized depositional pattern in a lake with unusual toponymy, a radiocarbon date from associated wood aligning with the right century, a metallurgical signature suggesting high-status smithing at a time and a place near a known war leader's activity. And while none of these alone would enthrone a blade, together they would make an approach, a respectful way to name a sword as a candidate without nailing it to a cross of certainty, which is a healthier regime for myth. The conspiracy-minded will always prefer a hidden vault, a code carved into cloister stones, a family retaining the blade as guarantee of ancient debts. And such scenarios are not impossible so much as narratively satisfying. And narrative satisfaction is a force of its own, guiding research, museum exhibitions, and tourism. But the true secrecy may be simpler, lying in the unnoticed, in the sword mislabeled as later, in the lake no one scanned because a right-of-way lapsed, in the drawer that sticks, and acknowledging that mundanity shelters mystery prevents despair when tales refuse a showy finale. As technology leans forward, LiDAR continues to redraw marsh and fen into maps of vanished waters, while drones bring aerial calm to sites too soggy to cross on foot, and underwater photogrammetry stitches shadows into solid models of silt-buried shapes, making the future of this hunt a meditative one, less about heroic dives and more about careful listening to data's quiet. And in that listening, the lake logic returns, insisting that patience is a kind of offering, and offerings are how thresholds open, which means that the best way to meet the blade is to stop rushing toward it. Through all these angles, the sword's brightest power remains its concentration of legitimacy, a mirror in which societies see the ruler they wanted, feared, or deserved. And across centuries of reforms and revolts, the image continues to matter, because even in democracies, a heavy object carried with ceremony can make people breathe in unison. And Excalibur serves as an early lesson in the ethics of spectacle, showing how beauty and danger, mercy and might can be yoked to stabilize a story long enough for harvests to come in. And stories, like crops, are always at risk of blight. Perhaps the truest Excalibur now is an ecology of fragments, pressed leaves of etymology, museum cases with a darkness just beyond the glass, lake margins with dragonflies circling, where a hand once rose in someone's telling, and willing listeners tracing the contours with their own hopes. Because legends require audiences as much as heroes, and in the collaboration between blade and ear, a living artifact is maintained, warmed by breath, balanced between doubt and yearning. And this artifact can never be stolen, only neglected, which is the most banal and most dangerous threat of all. So the journey continues on night walks and library afternoons, across footbridges to islands that were never fully dry, among shelves that murmur with the weight of unindexed letters. And in every step, the taste of iron on the air suggests we are near the smithy's door again, near the waterline where reflections sharpen And though we may never watch the miraculous hand rise and offer us a certainty shining like white fire, we have the consolation of participating in an older rite, the rite of asking better questions, which may be the purest metal the legend provides. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.